In the days after Madeleine McCann vanished, the search was no longer just happening in Praia da Luz. It was happening in newspapers, on television, in police briefings, in hotel bars, on internet forums, around dinner tables, and in millions of homes across the world. A little girl was missing, and almost immediately, the world began asking the same question. Who did this? But in this case, suspicion didn't move in a straight line. It shifted, it circled, it landed on strangers, it landed on local residents, it landed on a British man living in Praia da Luz. And most controversially of all, it eventually landed on Madeleine's own parents. What follows isn't an accusation, it isn't a verdict, and it isn't an attempt to solve this case from behind a microphone. This is the story of how one disappearance became one of the most fiercely debated criminal investigations of the 21st century. The suspects, the allegations, the investigative theories, the media storm, the mistakes, the renewed searches, and the town left carrying a name it never asked to become famous. Because after the 3rd of May 2007, Praia da Luz was no longer simply a holiday destination. It became a place frozen in time, a place where every anniversary reopened old wounds, where every documentary brought television crews back to its streets, where every reported breakthrough raised fresh hope, only to leave more unanswered questions. Nearly 2 decades have passed, millions of words have been written, thousands of theories have been shared, countless people believe they already know what happened. Others are convinced the truth has never been uncovered. But there's an important difference between suspicion and proof. Throughout this episode, we'll make that distinction every step of the way. We'll examine what investigators believe. We'll explore why certain people came under suspicion. We'll explain why some theories gained traction while others fell apart. And where there are allegations, we'll call them allegations. Where there is evidence, we'll call it evidence. Because those two things aren't always the same. This is the story of the investigation after the investigation, the case that refused to fade away, and the mystery that still divides opinion around the world. This is episode 2 of the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. Welcome back to What They Hide, Hidden Crimes in Plain Sight. I'm Matt, and I'm your host. If you'd like to support the show, you'll find the Buy Me a Coffee link in the episode description. You can also follow the podcast on all the socials, and if you'd like to suggest a case or get in touch, you'll find all the details in the episode description. And as always, if you enjoy the show, please consider following, leaving a rating and sharing the podcast. It genuinely helps more people discover the show, and I really appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do it. Before we begin, today's episode discusses the disappearance of a child, criminal investigations and allegations made against individuals over many years. Some of those allegations were investigated by police, others originated in the media or public discussion. Where allegations are mentioned, they will be presented as allegations, unless they're supported by established evidence or findings made in court. Listener discretion is advised. If you haven't listened to episode 1, I'd strongly recommend going back and starting there. In that episode, we followed the documented timeline. We looked at the events leading up to Madeleine McCann's disappearance, the search, the first hours of the investigation, the emergence of the first suspect, and the decision by Portuguese authorities to make Kate and Gerry McCann arguidos before later lifting that status when the investigation was archived. Everything we covered came from the documented investigation. Today, we're stepping into what happened afterwards. How one missing child investigation became one of the most debated criminal cases in modern history. We'll examine why different people came under suspicion. We'll look at investigative theories that have shaped public opinion. we'll explore how some leads appeared promising before reaching dead ends. We'll separate what investigators believed from what they could prove. And perhaps most importantly, we'll separate evidence from speculation. Because after almost 2 decades, those two things have often become blurred. This episode isn't about deciding who's guilty. It's about understanding why this case continues to divide police officers, journalists, investigators, and the public to this day. So, let's return to Portugal, not to the night Madeleine McCann disappeared, but to what happened after the headlines spread around the world. Because once the facts became public, the theories began. When Madeleine McCann disappeared on the evening of the 3rd of May 2007, investigators began with the same assumption they would in almost any missing child case. Look outwards. Who had been near the apartment? Who had been seen around the Ocean Club? Who didn't belong? For weeks, that was exactly what detectives did. Witnesses were interviewed, holidaymakers were traced, staff were questioned, potential sightings were investigated across Portugal and beyond. Every lead was examined, every possibility explored. The hope was that somewhere outside apartment 5A, someone had made a mistake. Someone had been seen. Someone had left behind the one piece of evidence that could explain what had happened. But as the weeks became months, that breakthrough never came. Investigators weren't standing still. They were eliminating possibilities. And in any major criminal investigation, when one avenue reaches a dead end, detectives have little choice but to go back to the beginning, to ask difficult questions, to challenge assumptions, and sometimes to look in places they never expected to. That doesn't mean investigators have reached a conclusion. Far from it. It meant they were testing every reasonable hypothesis against the evidence they had. That's exactly what detectives are supposed to do. No individual should be ruled in or ruled out without evidence. But outside the investigation, public opinion didn't always see it that way. By now, newspapers weren't simply reporting the search for Madeleine. They were trying to explain it. Every day seemed to bring another exclusive, another unnamed police source, another front-page headline claiming the investigation had taken a dramatic turn. Television studios debated developments before detectives had even finished examining them. Rumours spread across internet forums at a speed no police force could ever hope to match. For the McCann family, every newspaper became another source of anxiety. Every television report raised new questions. Every headline carried the possibility that public opinion was about to shift again. And behind the scenes, Portuguese detectives were examining every aspect of the family's movements. Not because they'd decided Kate or Gerry McCann were responsible, but because investigators have a duty to examine every realistic possibility, even when those possibilities involve the people closest to the missing person. History has shown that difficult questions can't be avoided simply because they're uncomfortable. Equally, difficult questions aren't the same as evidence. That's a distinction that's often forgotten in this case. Investigators don't need certainty to ask questions. They need evidence before reaching conclusions. In the summer of 2007, detectives believed they needed to look more closely at one particular line of inquiry. That decision would become one of the most controversial moments in the entire investigation. It would divide public opinion, dominate newspaper headlines, and forever change the way millions of people viewed the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. In early September, Kate and Gerry McCann returned to police headquarters in Portimão. When they left, nothing about this case would ever be the same again. On the 7th of September 2007, Kate McCann was asked to attend police headquarters in Portimão. For hours she answered questions from Portuguese detectives. The following day Gerry McCann was also interviewed. By this point, more than 4 months had passed since Madeleine disappeared. Investigators had followed countless leads, searches had been carried out, witnesses had been interviewed and re-interviewed. Forensic evidence had been examined, yet the investigation still hadn't identified what had happened to Madeleine. Behind the scenes, detectives believed they needed to test another possibility. It was a decision that would soon become front-page news around the world. When the interviews concluded, Kate and Gerry McCann were both declared arguidos. Outside Portugal, the headlines were immediate. Parents named official suspects. For many people, reading those words in Britain and elsewhere, it sounded as though detectives believed they'd solved the case. But that's not what arguido means. Under Portuguese law at the time, arguido was a formal legal status given to someone who was under investigation. It gave that person important legal rights, including the right to legal representation and the right not to answer questions that might incriminate them. Becoming an arguido wasn't a finding of guilt, it wasn't a criminal charge, and it certainly wasn't a conviction. It was a procedural step that allowed investigators to question someone under a different legal framework. That legal distinction was often lost once the story crossed international borders. Television bulletins reduced a complex legal process to a handful of dramatic words. Newspapers competed to publish exclusive details about what detectives were supposedly thinking. Many of those reports relied on anonymous sources. Some were accurate, others weren't. The result was a public conversation in which facts, leaks, and speculation became increasingly difficult to separate. So why did detectives decide to take this step? Portuguese investigators were examining several pieces of information that in their view justified further scrutiny. These included the timeline established by witness statements, the results of ongoing forensic inquiries, and information that had emerged during the investigation over previous months. At that stage, detectives believed those lines of inquiry deserved further examination. Importantly, believing something should be investigated isn't the same as proving it happened. Investigators routinely explore possibilities that are later ruled out. That's part of the investigative process. Kate and Gerry McCann continued to deny any involvement in Madeleine's disappearance. They maintained that Madeleine had been abducted. Their legal team strongly rejected suggestions that they had harmed their daughter or concealed what had happened. As public interest intensified, the pressure on the family became extraordinary. Every interview was analysed, every facial expression was interpreted, every public appearance became headline news. Supporters argued the parents were being unfairly scrutinised while their daughter was still missing. Critics questioned aspects of the investigation and the decisions made on the night Madeleine disappeared. The case was no longer being argued only in interview rooms. It was being argued in newspapers, on television, and increasingly across the internet. The investigation had entered a new phase, one where public opinion often moved faster than the evidence. But there was another development that would fuel that debate even further. Specialist British search dogs had been brought to Portugal. Their work would become one of the most discussed and most misunderstood aspects of the entire Madeleine McCann investigation. Even today, nearly 20 years later, people are still arguing about what those dogs found. And perhaps more importantly, what they didn't. By the summer of 2007, the investigation had reached a point where Portuguese detectives wanted additional specialist assistance. Among those brought in from the United Kingdom was one of Britain's most experienced police dog handlers, Martin Grime. Grime worked with 2 highly trained English Springer Spaniels. Each dog had a different role. The first, Eddie, was trained to detect the scent associated with human cadaver odour. The second, Keeler, was trained to detect human blood. It's important to understand what these dogs were trained to do. They weren't trained to identify who had died, they couldn't determine when a death had occurred, and they couldn't tell investigators how blood came to be in a particular location. Their job was much narrower. To indicate the possible presence of a scent they'd been trained to detect. Nothing more, nothing less. When Eddie and Keeler arrived in Praia da Luz, they were taken to several locations connected with the investigation. The searches included apartment 5A, neighbouring apartments, surrounding areas and vehicles linked to the inquiry. The searches were conducted without the dogs being told where investigators believed evidence might be found. Detectives wanted the dogs to work independently. As Eddie searched apartment 5A, he gave indications in several areas. One was behind the sofa in the living room, another was inside the parents' bedroom. He also indicated near a section of clothing. Later, Keeler gave indications in some overlapping areas. The dogs were also deployed to vehicles connected with the investigation, including a hire car used by the McCann family weeks after Madeleine disappeared. Again, the dogs made a number of indications. To detectives, these were developments that couldn't simply be ignored. But they also weren't answers. An indication by a trained dog is an investigative lead. It's a reason to look more closely. It's not proof that a crime has taken place. Police still needed independent evidence to support whatever the dogs had detected. That's where forensic science comes in. Samples collected after the dogs' searches were sent for laboratory analysis. Scientists examined traces recovered from the apartment, from clothing and from the hire vehicle. Over the years, there's been enormous confusion about what those forensic examinations found. Some reports suggested DNA belonging to Madeleine had been discovered. Others claimed the results proved nothing at all. The reality is more complicated. Laboratory testing identified mixed and partial DNA profiles from some of multiple samples. Because the material was limited and contained genetic material from more than one person, scientists couldn't draw definitive conclusions linking those samples to Madeleine in a way that met the evidential standard required for a criminal prosecution. In other words, the forensic testing didn't provide proof that Madeleine had died in apartment 5A, nor did it provide evidence capable of proving that Kate or Gerry McCann had caused her death. That's a crucial distinction. The dogs indicated, the scientists examined the material, but the laboratory results didn't establish the conclusion many people believed they did. Even Martin Grime, the dog's handler, consistently explained that a dog's indication should never be treated as evidence on its own. It must always be supported by other evidence. Without that supporting evidence, an indication remains exactly what investigators call it. An indication. Nothing more, nothing less. Despite that, the story quickly took on a life of its own. Headlines around the world reduced a complex forensic issue to a handful of dramatic sentences. Some newspapers reported that the dogs had solved the case. Others dismissed their work entirely. Neither description reflected the full picture. The truth sat somewhere in the middle. The dogs identified areas that investigators believed deserved further examination. The subsequent forensic testing didn't provide evidence capable of proving the theory that many people assumed the dogs had confirmed. Nearly 20 years later, those searches are still debated. Some investigators believe the dogs highlighted something significant that science couldn't fully explain. Others point out that criminal cases aren't decided on possibilities. They're decided on evidence that can be tested, challenged, and ultimately proved. Whatever view someone takes, one thing is beyond dispute. The work of Eddie and Keeler changed the direction of the investigation. It influenced the questions detectives asked, it influenced public opinion, and it remains one of the central reasons why the Madeleine McCann case continues to divide people to this day. But there was someone else whose interpretation of those developments would become just as influential. The former lead detective, a man who believed the investigation had taken the wrong path. His name was Gonçalo Amaral, and his theory would spark a legal battle that continues to shape public discussion of this case even now. Every major investigation leaves behind unanswered questions. Sometimes those questions stay inside police files. Sometimes they find their way into the public. In the Madeleine McCann case, one of the loudest voices belonged to the man who'd once been leading the investigation itself. His name was Gonçalo Amaral, a senior detective with the Polícia Judiciária. In the early months after Madeleine disappeared, Amaral had been one of the officers responsible for directing the Portuguese investigation. He'd overseen interviews, searches, the collection of evidence, and many of the decisions made during those critical first months. But by October 2007, only a few weeks after Kate and Gerry McCann had been made arguidos, Amaral was removed from the investigation. That decision followed public comments he had made criticising the involvement of British police in the case. Portuguese authorities replaced him with another senior investigator. For Amaral, that wasn't the end of his involvement. Far from it. The following year, after the Portuguese investigation had been archived, he published a book. It quickly became a bestseller in Portugal. In it, Amaral argued that Madeleine hadn't been abducted. Instead, he set out his own investigative theory about what he believed had happened. It's important to pause here. What follows is Gonçalo Amaral's theory. It isn't an established fact, it wasn't proven in court, and no court has concluded that this theory explains what happened to Madeleine McCann. Amaral argued that Madeleine died inside apartment 5A and that her death was later concealed. He based that view on his interpretation of the available evidence, including aspects of the timeline, the dog indications discussed in the previous chapter, and other elements of the Portuguese investigation. Kate and Gerry McCann have always completely rejected that theory. They've consistently maintained that Madeleine was abducted. They've repeatedly denied any involvement in her disappearance. The disagreement didn't remain confined to interviews or newspaper articles. It moved into the courts. The McCanns brought legal proceedings in Portugal over Amaral's book and related media appearances, arguing that the claims damaged both their reputation and the search for Madeleine. The legal battle continued for years through the Portuguese courts. Ultimately, Portugal's highest court upheld Amaral's right to express his opinion about the investigation, while making no finding that his theory was correct. That's another distinction that's often misunderstood. A court deciding that someone has the legal right to publish a theory isn't the same as a court deciding that the theory is true. Those are two completely different legal questions. By now, public opinion had become deeply divided. Some believed Amaral's theory offered the most convincing explanation for the unanswered questions. Others believed it relied too heavily on inference and overlooked the lack of evidence capable of supporting criminal charges. The investigation itself remained unresolved. No one had been prosecuted. No court had determined what happened to Madeleine, and despite the certainty with which many people argued their position, certainty wasn't something the evidence could provide. As the years passed, the case slowly disappeared from the front pages. The cameras left Praia da Luz. The daily headlines stopped. To many people, it felt as though the investigation had quietly reached the end of the road. But behind the scenes, British detectives weren't ready to give up. A few years later, the Metropolitan Police would launch a review unlike anything seen before in a missing child investigation. It was called Operation Grange, and it would breathe new life into a case that many people believed had gone cold. By 2010, the investigation into Madeleine McCann's disappearance had largely fallen quiet. The Portuguese investigation had been archived, the media frenzy had eased, the television cameras had moved on, but for Kate and Gerry McCann, life hadn't returned to normal. Every birthday, every Christmas, every anniversary was another reminder that their daughter was still missing. They continued campaigning, they continued appealing for information, and they continued asking police not to give up. Behind the scenes, there were growing calls in Britain for a fresh review of the case, not because detectives believed they'd solved it, but because they wanted to know whether anything had been overlooked. In May 2011, the Metropolitan Police launched a review known as Operation Grange. Unlike the original Portuguese investigation, Operation Grange wasn't initially a criminal investigation. Its first task was to examine everything that had come before, every witness statement, every forensic report, every timeline, every decision, every investigative lead. The review team worked through tens of thousands of documents supplied by the Portuguese authorities and by British police. It was a painstaking process. Detectives weren't trying to prove a particular theory. They were looking for opportunities, a witness who had never been traced, a statement that deserved another look, a line of inquiry that technology in 2011 might answer better than it could in 2007. As the review continued, investigators identified what they described as hundreds of potential leads. Some had already been explored, others hadn't. The Metropolitan Police eventually concluded that there were enough unanswered questions to justify turning the review into a full criminal investigation. Operation Grange entered a new phase. British detectives began travelling regularly to Portugal. They worked alongside Portuguese authorities, sharing information and comparing evidence gathered years earlier. The relationship between the two investigations wasn't always straightforward. Different legal systems, different investigative approaches, different priorities, yet both sides shared the same objective: finding out what had happened to Madeleine. One of the strengths of Operation Grange was that it benefited from advances in technology. Telecommunications analysis had improved, digital mapping had become more sophisticated. Investigators were able to re-examine mobile phone records, vehicle movements and witness accounts with tools that simply hadn't existed in the same form in 2007. Some witnesses were interviewed again, others came forward for the first time. Old assumptions were challenged, new possibilities emerged. Perhaps the most significant public development came in 2013. British police appeared on the BBC programme Crime Watch, presenting revised timelines and appealing for fresh witnesses. One image, in particular, captured public attention. An electronic facial image of a man investigators wanted to identify. The appeal generated hundreds of new calls. Among the responses was information that helped detectives resolve one of the most famous sightings in the case: the man seen carrying a child by Jane Tanner on the night Madeleine disappeared was identified as an innocent holidaymaker carrying his own daughter back from the resort's creche. For years he'd been viewed as one of the investigation's most important unidentified figures. Now, detectives believed they had eliminated him from their inquiries. It was an important reminder of how investigations evolve. One of the biggest mysteries from 2007 had been explained, not through speculation, but through evidence. Yet despite years of work, Madeleine was still missing. Operation Grange had ruled out some possibilities, refined others, and uncovered entirely new lines of inquiry. Then, more than a decade after Madeleine vanished, one of those new lines led investigators towards a German national with a long criminal history. His name had never featured prominently during the early investigation, but that was about to change, and for the first time in many years, police believed they had a suspect whose background demanded very close scrutiny. For years, the Madeleine McCann investigation seemed trapped in the past. Detectives revisited old witness statements, re-examined familiar timelines, followed fresh tips that often led nowhere. Then, in 2020, everything changed. German prosecutors announced they were investigating a man they suspected may have been responsible for Madeleine McCann's disappearance. His name was Christian Brückner. Unlike many of the names that had surfaced over the years, Brückner wasn't someone who'd become the focus of media speculation before investigators showed an interest. He'd already been known to police. He had a lengthy criminal record, including convictions for offences such as burglary and sexual offences. In 2019, he was also convicted in Germany of the rape of an elderly American woman in Praia da Luz in 2005, a crime he denied before his conviction. For investigators, one detail immediately stood out. In 2007, Brückner had been living in and around the Algarve. He'd spent time in Praia da Luz. He was familiar with the area, and records showed that on the evening Madeleine disappeared, a mobile phone linked to him was used in the vicinity of Praia da Luz. German prosecutors have said they believe this phone activity is one element of a much wider body of evidence. However, they haven't publicly disclosed all of that evidence. Investigators have explained that they believe releasing certain details could compromise the ongoing investigation. That has inevitably led to public speculation. People naturally ask the same question. If investigators are so confident, why hasn't anyone been charged? The answer is surprisingly straightforward. Police can suspect someone, they can investigate someone, they can even publicly identify someone as a suspect in certain legal systems. But bringing a criminal charge requires prosecutors to believe there's sufficient admissible evidence to present a realistic prospect of conviction in court. Those are very different thresholds. German investigators have repeatedly stated that they believe Madeleine is dead. They've also said they suspect Brückner was responsible, but they haven't publicly revealed the evidence that led them to those conclusions. Christian Brückner has consistently denied any involvement in Madeleine McCann's disappearance. He hasn't been charged with any offence relating to her case, and as things stand today, no court has examined or ruled upon the allegations made against him. That distinction is critically important. Suspicion isn't proof, an investigation isn't a conviction. And allegations, however serious, remain allegations unless they're proven in court. Even so, the announcement transformed the investigation. For the first time in many years, detectives appeared to have a clear direction. Portuguese authorities reopened aspects of the investigation. German police continued pursuing new inquiries. British detectives from Operation Grange remain involved. The three countries worked together in a way that hadn't been seen during the early years of the case. There were renewed searches. Investigators returned to parts of the Algarve. Reservoirs, abandoned buildings, and rural land were examined. Each new search generated headlines around the world. Each one sparked renewed hope that perhaps this would finally be the breakthrough. So far, none has produced the definitive answer the world has been waiting for. The frustration is felt nowhere more deeply than in Praia da Luz itself, because while the rest of the world revisits this case every anniversary, the people who live there have never fully been able to leave it behind. For them, Madeleine McCann isn't just a headline, it's part of the history of their town. Today, if you visit Praia da Luz, you'll find much the same place Kate and Gerry McCann arrived at in April 2007. The sea still rolls gently on the beach, families still eat in the restaurants overlooking the bay, children still splash in swimming pools, holidaymakers still come looking for sunshine. On the surface, very little has changed. But speak to people who have lived there for years, and many will tell you that everything changed. Before May 2007, Praia da Luz was known as a peaceful holiday resort, a place where people escaped the pressure of everyday life. After Madeleine disappeared, its name became recognised across the globe. For many residents, that brought emotions that were often difficult to reconcile. There was sadness for a little girl who never came home, sympathy for a family living through unimaginable uncertainty. But there was also frustration. For years, television crews returned every anniversary. Newspapers arrived whenever there was a reported breakthrough. Documentary makers walked the same streets, the same apartment, the same beach, the same restaurants, again and again. Some local business owners later spoke about visitors cancelling holidays. Others worried that their town had become known for only one thing. For younger generations growing up in Praia da Luz, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann wasn't just something they read about. It became part of the town's identity, a story inherited from one generation to the next. Even now, many visitors arrive already knowing exactly where apartment 5A is. Some walk past quietly, others stop to take photographs. For the people who actually live there, it's a constant reminder of a night they'd rather forget. And yet, despite everything that's happened, the investigation continues. Operation Grange remains open in the United Kingdom. German investigators continue pursuing their inquiries. Portuguese authorities have assisted with renewed searches whenever new investigative opportunities have arisen. Over the years, millions of pounds have been spent. Thousands of witness statements have been taken. Countless hours of CCTV, phone records and forensic evidence have been reviewed. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann has become one of the most expensive and extensive missing child investigations in British history. And still, one question remains unanswered. What happened inside or outside apartment 5A on the evening of the 3rd of May 2007? It's a question that has divided experienced detectives, it has divided journalists, it has divided legal experts, and it has divided the public. Some people believe the answer lies in the earliest days of the investigation. Others believe the key emerged years later. Some are convinced investigators already know what happened. Others believe the truth has yet to be discovered. The reality is simpler. The investigation has produced theories, it has produced suspects, it has produced allegations, it has produced enormous amounts of information, but it hasn't yet produced a criminal conviction. It hasn't answered every question, and it hasn't brought Madeleine home. Perhaps that's why this case still grips the world. Not because it's the most complex investigation ever conducted, not because it's the most famous missing child case in history, but because despite everything, there is no ending, no courtroom verdict, no final chapter, only a little girl whose family have spent almost 2 decades searching for answers. As we've said throughout these 2 episodes, it's important to separate established facts from theories. to distinguish evidence from opinion, and to remember that in any criminal investigation, certainty must come from proof, not from repetition. Until that proof exists, the questions will continue, the debates will continue, the searches may continue, and every year, on the anniversary of the 3rd of May, the world remembers a little girl with blonde hair, bright eyes, and a wide smile. A little girl who should have celebrated countless birthdays with her family. Instead, she became one of the world's most recognizable missing children. Whatever happened to Madeleine McCann, the hope shared by investigators, by her family and by millions of people around the world remains the same. That one day, the truth will finally be known. And if that day ever comes, it won't end the sadness, but perhaps it will finally bring the answers that have been missing for so long. Thank you for listening to What They Hide, Hidden Crimes in Plain Sight. If you've stayed with me through both parts of this series, thank you. I know the disappearance of Madeleine McCann is a case many people feel they already know, but my hope has been to strip away as much of the noise as possible and separate the documented facts from the theories that have surrounded this investigation for almost 2 decades. Whether you believe the answers lie in the earliest days of the investigation, whether you think the key emerged years later, or whether you believe the truth still hasn't been uncovered, one thing is certain: a little girl disappeared, and her family have spent every day since living with the uncertainty of not knowing what happened to their daughter. Whatever your opinion of the investigation, it's worth remembering that behind every headline, every documentary and every online debate is a real family whose lives changed forever on the evening of the 3rd of May 2007. If you've enjoyed this 2-part series, I'd really appreciate it if you could follow the podcast, leave a rating or review, and share it with someone else who enjoys true crime. Those small things make a huge difference and help more people discover the show. If you'd like to support the podcast even further, you'll find the Buy Me a Coffee link in the episode description. Every contribution helps me continue researching these cases and producing new episodes. As always, I'd love to hear what you thought of the series. You can get in touch through the show's social media pages or by email using the details in the episode description. Next time, on What They Hide, we'll be turning our attention to another case that shocked the world. A story where the public thought they knew exactly what had happened, until the evidence began telling a very different story. One investigation, countless questions, and a truth that proved far more complicated than anyone first imagined. Until then, take care of yourselves, look after the people you love, and remember, the biggest mysteries aren't always hidden in the darkest places. Sometimes, they're hidden in plain sight.